Hi everybody, this is Lauren Sommer and here is my presentation on the Pacific Climate Warriors for week 8. So who are the Pacific Climate Warriors? The Pacific Climate Warriors are a grassroots climate activist group that is primarily led by young people to fight climate change, operating in 15 of the Pacific Island nations. They formed up with a larger global organization, 350.org, so they are also known as 350 Pacific, which helps them to gain more resources and attention to their cause. They organize and lead workshops to, quote, educate and empower youth. The main concerns of the Pacific Climate Warriors stem from rising sea levels they are already experiencing, as well as what the projected sea level rise will be in the future as a result of the continuing emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Rising sea levels are threatening their way of life. They want to ensure that emissions are curbed so that we can limit global warming to no more than 2 degrees. The Pacific Climate Warriors are particularly concerned with and protesting the fossil fuel industry in Australia. In 2014, the Australian government approved the construction of one of the largest coal mines in the world, quote, doubling Australia's annual coal production, end quote. Also a chief concern is the world's largest coal port, which is in Newcastle, Australia, and it's contributing to, quote, million tons of carbon pollution, end quote. And the government wants to expand the port to export more coal, leading to even more carbon pollution. The Pacific Islands and their peoples are facing the brunt of climate change consequences when they are only responsible for 1% of global carbon emissions. The Pacific Climate Warriors are working tirelessly to protect their home from these major threats. Kevin Liongo Aipopo describes one of the consequences of sea level rise and why it's important to fight for change. Quote, the history of our people will have been swallowed by the ocean and become a myth, a story, end quote. One major campaign that the Pacific Climate Warriors organized and led was the Newcastle Flotilla protest in October of 2014. They paddled traditional handmade canoes to the coal port in Newcastle, Australia, with 13 islands participating in order to protest the fossil fuel industry there. George Nasewa, a climate warrior, stated that, quote, we live the realities of climate change, end quote. Their goals were to, quote, get Australia to reconsider their commitment to expanding the fossil fuel industry, end quote, as well as to, quote, highlight these impacts of climate change to share our stories with the rest of the world, end quote, as described by Ariane Kasman, another climate warrior. They were joined by hundreds of Australians helping to block coal ships with canoes, kayaks, and surfboards. The Pacific Climate Warriors were able to successfully delay 10 coal ships scheduled to port that day. Another success, as stated by Mikhail Mayava, another climate warrior, was that they showed the, quote, power of solidarity, the power of people coming together to actually make a change, end quote. And here are some pictures that I found of the protest that day, showing the traditional canoes blocking the coal ships in the background. Immediately following the Newcastle Flotilla protests, just one day later, Pacific Climate Warriors organized their community to participate in a national divestment day called Divest for the Pacific, where they advocated for Australians to, quote, move money out of the financial institutions that are funding climate destruction, end quote. They also organized peaceful protests occupying offices for the industry representing the coal companies in Australia, where activists were arrested in several cases. These actions helped to successfully draw attention from the media to the negative impacts of fossil fuel projects, as well as the work of the activists. More recently, the Pacific Climate Warriors, now mostly operating under the name 350 Pacific, have focused a majority of their efforts in helping the communities of Tonga, Fiji, and Samoa in recovery from a major volcanic eruption and tsunami in January of this year. Prior to this recent devastating disaster, they focused a lot on sharing the voices of the frontline communities they represent to make sure that the people who are impacted by climate change are the ones speaking and representing their causes. They've done this through films, speeches, protests, and rallies. The Pacific Climate Warriors also went to the most recent UN Climate Change Conference, also called COP26, to speak and participate in climate negotiations. 350 Pacific Climate Warriors also lead education workshops. The most recent example is their solar power workshop just several weeks ago to Tongans following the tsunami disaster. And that's it for this week. And here is my list of resources, which I'll also post underneath this video. Thanks very much.